Hello, welcome listeners to another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love, hosted by Richard Osler. My guest on today's podcast, joining me from Provo, Utah, is my new friend Helen Anderson. Welcome to the podcast, Helen.
Thank you, and thank you for letting me be a guest. I'm really excited to do this. Go ahead.
We are glad to have you as a guest, and you may wonder sometimes how I find my guests. Most of my guests find me. And sometimes it's a DM on social media. Sometimes it's an email. And this is an email I got from Helen. I'll just read a little bit because it's a good way to introduce. The short summary is, I'm an LDS mom in Provo with 4 kids, including a young adult trans daughter who currently goes to the University of Utah. I've been doing stand-up comedy on the side for the last few years. And I won't read all of this. My goal is to humanize queer experiences through humor. My friend and I are planning a Mother's Day music comedy show to celebrate supportive moms of LGBTQ kids this May. And she's going to talk about that show. It's called Dear Mom, Celebrating Mothers of LGBTQ Children. It's on May 10th, 2 p.m. in Provo, and Helen will give us more details, and we'll link to that in the show notes. And she's also going to talk about just her journey supporting her adult trans daughter. So if you're a parent with a trans kid or a non-binary kid or a local leader or a family member, I think what Helen will share with you really vulnerably and sometimes a little raw and human is her journey. And then this also journey, what can I do to support? Kind of in a proactive way. And everybody does that a little differently. Some are artists and do artwork. Some share their stories. Some do stand-up comedy. This is the first time I've heard this version, but it's just kind of acting on your gifts and your spiritual impressions. What can I do in my circle of influence? So here you are bravely doing an event on May 10th, and that takes courage. So I'm really glad to have you on the podcast, Helen, and look forward to hearing your story and learning more about the event.
Thank you. It's a privilege. And as I was putting my notes together for this episode, a key theme that stood out for me was how important it is to share personal stories. And this is the first time I'm sharing mine on a podcast, but also I'm going to be sharing the story of, so as you know, I'm going to be sharing the story of my daughter coming out as trans, but or as I sometimes put it, how we learned after 17 years that the ultrasound was wrong. But first, I want to talk about stories that influenced me and prepared me for her coming out. So first, I'll give some of my own background. I grew up LDS. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, living in the Midwest. And I knew not so much from church as just from the broader culture that homosexuality was disapproved of and made fun of. And I didn't really think much about it until high school. I had friends in choir and theater who were probably gay, although it was very rare in those days for teens to be out. It was probably unsafe for them. And this was also during the AIDS epidemic, which added to the stigma, but it also made it a more frequent topic of conversation. And I found myself naturally sympathizing with gay people. Now, the term LGBTQ wasn't something that we had then, so I will often be referring to the gay community or gay people, and today we would probably say LGBTQ. But I was only vaguely aware of church teachings against homosexuality, and I hadn't internalized them. But what I had internalized was the teachings of Jesus Christ, to love one another, judge not, do unto others, etc. And not that I was perfect, because I had my own biases and I could get really catty sometimes. But I had already sensed that there was something unfair about how the gay community was viewed and treated. And then I read a book that had a major influence on me. And the book was Goodbye, I Love You by Carol Lynn Pearson. Has she been on your podcast before?
She has once. It was really an honor to have her, and what a great book.
Yeah. And so, for those who aren't familiar with the book, it's about her life being married to a gay man and how hard he tried to change and how messy but beautiful their relationship was. And hearing the details of their situation made the struggle very real for me. And in getting ready for this podcast, I bought the book again so I could reread it because I wanted to make sure I was remembering it correctly because I hadn't read it for decades. And there's this quote that stood out to me this second time around. And the quote is, "When dogma collides with experience, when the people involved are those you love, you see with different eyes." And that's how I felt reading her story. I felt like I got to know her and her husband and saw her story through the eyes of love. And her story also reinforced some conclusions that I was already kind of coming to on my own. One is it didn't seem like homosexuality was a choice, and it didn't seem to be something that could change, even with something like electroshock therapy, which she mentioned in the book, some people had tried. And I just kind of naturally compared it to my own heterosexuality, which, was not something I chose and couldn't imagine it being changed by any kind of external influence. And I could see how the message that you're unworthy unless you change seemed very hurtful and demoralizing. And for a long time, I wanted to do something about that. I wanted to help the gay community in some way. I majored in theater at BYU, so I had even more friends who were struggling with this. Not always out, but I could kind of tell. But also, I went to BYU Law School, and I even did a little bit of independent study on gay rights. And I kind of had this hope that someday maybe I could do some advocacy work, but that never happened. After graduating, I had children. I was the main provider for my family, so I didn't have the time or know how to be an advocate. There weren't any obvious pathways at the time, and also, frankly, I didn't have the courage. I was kind of a closeted ally. I would share my opinions in private conversations, but not much more than that. Occasionally, for example, if there was a Relief Society lesson or something was said that made it sound like, it was wrong to be homosexual, I didn't speak up because I sympathize with the teacher. I know how hard it is to teach a lesson and how vulnerable you are as a teacher, and I didn't want to correct them or catch them off guard or anything like that. And I also didn't know if anyone else would disagree with me and get into an argument. So I was kind of a closeted ally. However, it did influence how I raised my kids. And I don't remember any specific talks or lessons that I gave them, but I do know if I heard something that was negative about someone who was gay, I would stop and say, "Hey, we're not going to talk like that. It's okay to be gay." So I tried to make that message clear in my family. And again, not that I was perfect. I'm sure I said some things that were insensitive occasionally. So then that brings me to the issue of transgender people. So even though I was a kind of an ally to my gay friends in that community, I didn't know anyone who was transgender. Transgender people were not on my radar. If anything, I thought it was kind of strange, and I was probably a little transphobic. And that leads me to the next story that influenced me. So I had a coworker about 10 years ago. I had a coworker who, as far as I knew, was female. And she always dressed very stylishly. She was very pretty. And I worked with her not all the time, but occasionally. But she was always very competent. I liked her. I respected her. And then I came across a documentary called Trans Mormon. It was produced by, I think, KUER here in Utah. And the documentary is about a trans woman in Utah who grew up LDS and how she struggled with gender dysphoria and how her parents overcame their concerns and apprehensions and supported her transitioning. And her parents' love really comes through in this documentary. And that documentary was about my coworker. So I didn't know until then that she was transgender.
Wow.
And it changed my perception of transgender people immediately. It, for lack of a better word, it normalized it for me. And the funny thing is, this usually happens the opposite way. You meet someone who's different from you, like someone who's trans, you get to know them, and that changes your perception. But in my case, I already knew this person and really liked her. I just didn't know she was trans until I saw that documentary. But even more surprising to me was I figured out that I knew her family. I pieced together some clues that were in the documentary and realized that her grandparents went to the same branch in Iowa that I did when I was in high school. Her grandparents and some of her uncles who were my age.
Wow.
Her grandmother was my young women's teacher for a time. And I probably even met this coworker when she was a baby, when her parents came to visit occasionally. And that wasn't just an interesting small world coincidence. It was meaningful to me because I knew how orthodox her parents I knew how orthodox her grandparents were, and probably her parents before she came out. And so that meant her parents' ability to change and adjust and support her transitioning was even more remarkable to me. So that prepared me for my trans daughter coming out a few years later. I didn't know that was going to happen at the time, and I'll get to that a little bit more in a minute. But I just want to say my reaction would have been very different if I hadn't seen that documentary and made that connection. And in fact, after my daughter came out, I went back and watched the documentary. And there's a place at the end where my coworker's dad says, "I hope this documentary that you're shooting will be watched by some parents, and that maybe something that we've said will help them, and through helping them, help their children." And that's exactly what it did for me. And I immediately messaged my coworker. She was no longer my coworker at that time, but I said, "Tell your parents thank you." I really was grateful. So now I'll share my daughter's story, or my story about my daughter coming out. So for some background, I have 4 children. This is my 3rd child. And to be safe, she asked me not to use her name. So I'll just call her my daughter. I won't give her age, but she's a young adult now. And she was assigned male at birth, but uses she, her pronouns now. And I'll use she, her consistently throughout the story just to keep it simple, even though we used he, him before she came out. So she had a normal childhood. Of course, we were happy she was born. We loved her. And when she was blessed as a baby, when her father gave her a blessing, one of the things he said was, "You will be a delight to your mother." And I always kind of wondered, well, what will that look like? That's something I looked forward to. She's a middle child like me. And you know what that's like for middle children. You know you're a middle child if your childhood home has more pictures of Jesus than you. She was always content. She got along with everyone. She was low maintenance. And she was very kind. One time, her kindergarten teacher called me during the day to let me know that my daughter befriended a classmate who didn't speak or didn't speak much. And the teacher was impressed by my daughter's kindness. And like a lot of kids, she needed speech therapy for a couple years. And at one point, I talked to her. I think it was her second or third grade teacher, trying to decide if she still needed this. And I told the teacher, well, I'm a little concerned. Is the speech impediment going to impair her ability to make friends? And the teacher said, oh, she has lots of friends. That's not an issue at all. So my point is that, she was kind, she was well liked, she had a normal childhood. She did Taekwondo for years. She showed more interest and consistency in that than my other kids. She got her black belt and higher degrees. She liked Magic the Gathering and tried to teach me, but I never did get the hang of it. Which is weird because I have a law degree and I still can't figure out how to play that game. And we still have Magic the Gathering cards floating around the house, and we have boxes of them in the attic, which is kind of like our year supply. I hope to barter with them during the second coming. And she also had an intense interest in math and science, and she took extra classes online and during the summer, and really is just a brilliant kid. I've been asked if there were signs that she was transgender. And, there really weren't any signs, not until later in high school. And I recently, someone shared their opinion with me that they think being transgender is the result of both nature and nurture. And I agree with the nature part. But I really can't think of anything in her environment that would have played a role in her being transgender other than we created a safe place for her to come out when she was ready. Her church, she attended church regularly. She did scouting. She held leadership positions. She blessed and passed the sacrament. And she looked forward to serving a mission. And then in high school, there were some signs. One is, she went to a high school that had a dress code, and for boys, you had to keep your hair short and a certain length above the ears or at the neck and that kind of thing. And she always, at the beginning of every school year, after growing her hair out over the summer, she hated getting it. She would wait till the very last minute to get it cut. And then her junior or senior year, I can't remember which, she kept her hair growing. And we didn't hear any complaints from the school. Now, just so you know, I did on occasion talk to my children about how important it is to follow the dress code at their school because they love that school and they love those teachers. And I said, it's a sign of respect to them to follow the dress code. But by the time she was a junior or senior, I was not micromanaging it. So I thought, well, let's just see what happens. We'll let it go. And if the school says something, then, she'll have to get it cut. And then sometimes I joked, and I don't know if this is good or bad now, but I joked with her, hey, I wonder if the administration at the school thinks you're transitioning and they're afraid to say something because they think we'll sue. Well, some other signs were that she started coming to church later and she would sit in the foyer, and I think she was avoiding blessing the sacrament. And I give her credit for that. I think she felt like there was something that wasn't quite right about that. And then she started dropping some clues. The first one was at her school, they had a Christmas dance, and the theme was wear an ugly sweater. And ugly sweaters are, very garish, overly decorated Christmas sweaters. And she came to me before the dance and she said, Mom, look at what I'm going to wear. And it was a women's top and it wasn't an ugly sweater. So I was a little confused. I thought maybe she doesn't know what an ugly sweater is. And, I asked and I said, are you sure? And she said, no, I know what an ugly sweater is, but this is what I'm going to wear. And then I said, well, does your date know you're wearing that? Because I didn't want her date. She had a friend that she was very close to. I didn't want her to be caught off guard or embarrassed. So I said, does your date know you're wearing this? And she said, oh, yeah, she's fine with it. So that was the first clue. And then sometime after that, I noticed some women's shoes in her room on the floor. And I started connecting the dots. And then there was a final clue that made it obvious. And I didn't say anything to her, but I was finally at the point where I realized this was really happening and I needed to accept it. And as prepared as I was, I still cried that night. And it's hard to explain why I cried because I really don't think this is necessarily a bad thing. And we'll talk later about how it was a good thing in many ways. But I'm sure many people in this situation can relate, many parents. It's kind of like you're losing the child you knew, and you don't know yet the child who is going to replace that one. And also, I had fears about, what this would mean. Would her life be difficult, and that kind of thing. And, recently I heard a transgender friend who performed a song that she wrote. And in introducing her song, she said, "This is a song about divorce. I've never been divorced, but this is how I felt when I decided to transition and knew some things were going to be hard." And I thought, that describes how I felt that night when I was coming to terms with this. It was going to be hard, but I could also see that it was necessary. So after one night of grieving, I was ready for whatever was next. But I did want to still wait for her to bring it up. And so for the next few weeks or months, I can't remember how long it was, I tried to do what I could to signal to her that she was safe to come out to me. And as one example of something that I did, and I don't even know if she remembers this, but we had a family home evening one time around Christmas. And I played 2 or 3 videos that were kind of inspirational, kind of Christmas themed. And around that time, you're probably familiar with the nonprofit Encircle. Encircle is an organization that supports LGBTQ youth. And at that time, they would publish or create a video around Christmas time with a theme. And that year, their video had the theme, "I love you," with an emphasis on you, meaning you as you are. And I played that video as part of this family home evening. And in the video, it has a little bit of a story. There's a young boy who is shopping with his mom. He sees some pink, sparkly cowboy boots and indicates to his mom that he'd really like to have those boots. The mom seems to be a little bit torn. And then the mom seems to have a little bit of an argument with the dad. But then on Christmas morning, the boy opens up the gift, and there are the pink cowboy boots. And then it ends with the line, "I love you," with the emphasis on you again. So that was one of the videos I played that evening. And again, I don't know if it made a difference, but I think it contributed to the overall goal, which was to make it clear to her that, we would accept her no matter what. And then the next thing that happened was we got an email from her school. The principal more or less emailed me and said, "Hey, we know that she's in a unique situation, but she really does need to comply with the dress code. Can you please, talk to her about getting a haircut?" And even though I kind of knew that she was trans, she hadn't really told me yet, and we hadn't had any kind of conversation about it yet. And so I said, yes, I'll talk to her. And it turns out that she had told one friend at school, and then that somehow kind of trickled up to the administration. And I'll talk about the conversation I had with my daughter in a minute. But first, I want to point out that I was not the first person she told, and I was okay with that. And I know for some parents, that's hard, and for some feel kind of hurt if the child doesn't come to them first. But to me, it totally makes sense because the stakes are so high when it comes to your family, especially if you're a minor. You're living at home, you depend on your parents for everything. If something goes wrong, it can go seriously wrong. So I can understand why an LGBTQ youth would want to test the waters with some friends or others before they actually come out to their parents. So I was okay with that. So then that night, after the email, I asked her, I said, what do you think the unique situation is referring to? And she said, I think you know, Mom. And then I, in a very long, roundabout way, asked the most verbose question. I said, well, is it referring to, do you think maybe, perhaps, are you identifying with maybe different, I mean, it was so non-ideal. And there are a few different things I would have done differently. We were talking in the kitchen, and we were like in different sides of the kitchen. And if I could do it over, I would have gotten close. I would have given her a hug. I would have not gone on and on trying to define transgender. Suddenly, I just couldn't find the words. But overall, it was okay. And she has only been expressed gratitude for how we've handled it. I did ask her how long she knew, and she said she'd always felt a little different and didn't know why, didn't know what it was, didn't know what to call it until more recently. And we talked about timing. Like, she didn't want to transition socially, wearing women's clothes or using she, her pronouns or changing her name while she was still in high school. Remember, in her high school, they had a dress code. She would have had to have worn a completely different uniform, a female uniform, if she wanted to present as female. And that was way too much of a leap at that time. I did have some surprising thoughts. And one is, from time to time, my kids would bring up tattoos, and I always try to discourage them from getting tattoos. And I would try to use logical arguments. Like, I'd say, well, they're permanent and you're young and you might change your mind and they're really hard to undo. And in this conversation with my daughter, when she came out, one of the thoughts I had, I didn't say it, but I thought, couldn't you just get a tattoo? And I say that to mean, suddenly my daughter coming out as trans put a whole lot of other things in perspective. A lot of other things that seemed super important were not as much anymore. Another thought that I had is, now my two older children by then had already either become inactive, left the church for reasons that I understand, and I won't get into that, but there was always a little part of me that kind of hoped they would come back, love to see them come back to church. And in that conversation with my trans daughter, where she came out, I was surprised to have the thought, I don't want you to go to church. It's not safe for you at church. And that really surprised me. And now I will say, later on in the journey, after she was out, we did consider, her coming to church, presenting as female. It never did happen, but in that process of discussing it, I went through kind of like a mental exercise thinking, well, how could we make this comfortable for everyone? Maybe I'll reach out to some of my ward friends and discuss it ahead of time. And I was kind of making a mental list of all the people in the ward who I knew who would be supportive and loving. And the more I thought about it, the longer the list got. And that was a really good feeling, knowing that we had a lot of friends in the ward who would be in her corner and support this. again, it was just a mental exercise, kind of like counting your blessings, but it felt really good. So then the next thing was for high school graduation, she decided that was when she was first going to present as female. It was the first time she wore a dress in public. She wore it under her graduation gown. And something that was really cool is she earned 3 academic awards, and the teachers presenting those awards used she, her pronouns, which had never happened before. Apparently, they had talked to her before the ceremony and said, we're going to be presenting this. How would you like us to refer to you? So it didn't involve me at all. And it was kind of a surprise. But it felt so good and so reassuring to see those adults, those authority figures, those people who also knew and loved her, to use those pronouns for her. On top of, being very proud of her winning these awards, it just felt really good to see the support in that community. And that was kind of like testing the waters. She still didn't use her new name or pronouns for a while, not until she started college later that fall. So she went to the University of Utah, and I'm so grateful that school kind of had a system in place for something like this. Move-in day was a great experience. There were older students helping freshmen move in, and they all wore name tags that had their pronouns, which was still a little bit new then. This was in 2019. And again, for me to see that as a mom, it was just so reassuring. It was a sign that she was going to be safe here. She was going to be included. And there were signs of inclusivity everywhere. She was assigned to a dorm, to a suite with 4 other female students. So they all had their own rooms, but they shared a bathroom. And these other female students had all indicated in their housing applications that they were allies. And so that was how, that's how the school was able to pair my daughter with someone who would be comfortable with that. And all of those young women became good friends. And, as a parent, that's really what you hope for when your child goes to college. You want them to have that college experience, living on campus, making friends, and a lot of times the friends you make in college become your lifelong friends. So I was so grateful for that. And the next year she was able to be an RA, or resident assistant. And I know we don't typically bring up politics, but I just want to say this year the legislature passed a law in Utah prohibiting that kind of arrangement. And it makes me sad for future trans students that they won't get to experience that. And it's also sad that it implies that trans students are some kind of a threat. But I also respect that some students may not feel comfortable sharing living space with someone who's transgender or LGBTQ. But I think it can be handled through, best practices, through a screening process like they did at U. So the day she moved in is the first day that I said something publicly about her being trans. I posted a picture of us on Facebook, and I used her new name and pronouns. I didn't want to make any kind of announcement like it was somehow good news or bad news. I didn't want to invite approval or disapproval. And I know some people do. They want to make an announcement for various reasons, and that's fine. But I just kind of wanted to fly under the radar and kind of treat it like this is our new normal. I did have a couple family members reach out and asked, do you have a transgender child? And mostly they were positive and supportive. I had one family member who had a harder time with it, and in over 2 or 3 conversations expressed disapproval. But I had to remind myself that I also had different opinions not that long ago, and it took me time to change, and I need to allow other people to have that time to change as well. And that family member has since come around and has tried to be more supportive, which I really appreciate. I have ward members who have occasionally asked about her. They use her pronouns and her new name, say, "Hey, how is she doing?" They're supportive and curious, which I appreciate. One sister came up to me and gave me a really sympathetic look and offered to talk as though it was some kind of sad tragedy. And I know that she meant well. And I know that for some people, that's the kind of support they need. They need a shoulder to cry on. But I didn't see it as a bad thing. And that takes me to, I'll kind of give an update now. Since she came out, she's been much happier and much livelier. She used to be very quiet and reserved, and now she's more outgoing, she's bubbly, and she truly brings light to all of our gatherings, every conversation. She has definitely been a delight to her mother, as her baby Blessing said. One of the things we like to do is go shopping together, and she lets me pick out her clothes. Unfortunately for her, that means she dresses like a woman in her 50s. Together, we look like 2/3 of the General Relief Society presidency. And next, I want to get her some glasses. I think she needs transition lenses, to complete the look. She's about to graduate from the U, thank goodness. Right now, she is working full-time and going to school full-time, and she is struggling in that sense. And I feel for her because she's just working herself so hard. I also worry for her safety in this political climate. She has a girlfriend, and they are very big support for each other. And one thing I appreciate about her is she's forgiving of mistakes we make. If we accidentally use the wrong pronouns or forget and use the wrong name for her or her friends. And also one thing I appreciate is she doesn't attend church since coming out, but she's never suggested to me that I should leave the church out of loyalty to her. I do feel a little isolated now that I'm no longer a member of Costco, but I am still a member of the church. I'm not as active as I once was for a variety of reasons, but not just for LGBTQ reasons. If anything, that has made me want to stay in order to help others if I can, but also because it seems like there's kind of this foregone conclusion that if you have a child who's gay, next thing you know, you're leaving the church. And I didn't want anyone to assume that was my path just because I had a trans daughter. Because again, I'd been supportive of the LGBTQ community for years. And so I wanted to kind of fight against that assumption. But anyway, that leads me to how I got involved with comedy. I was a fan of comedy for years growing up. And the reason I bring this up is I think it's important, to share personal stories. I think we learn from them. I think they can help others. I've been influenced by other people sharing their personal stories. And one of the ways I share my story is through stand-up comedy. I do have some jokes about being a mom to a trans daughter. But anyway, I was a fan of comedy growing up. I tried stand-up comedy in college. That was fun, but I didn't pursue it. And I picked it back up a few years ago once my kids were grown and I had a little bit more free time, more free time. And, but for a long time in the local comedy community, I felt like an outsider. Maybe because I'm a woman or I'm older, or maybe it was just my own perception and I lacked confidence. But about a year ago, I started going to a new open mic in the area. And it was in Provo, and it was called Others and Allies. And the person who started it, Amber J., who is now a good friend of mine, she's excellent at community building. It's her superpower. And she wanted to create a safe space for LGBTQ artists to perform, whether that's comedy, music, poetry. And I started going because it was close and it fit my schedule. And also, it's called Others and Allies. And I thought, well, I am an ally. And also, I kind of feel like an other too in this little subculture of comedy. So I started going. And since then, the community has grown. The regulars, the people who come every time, it's grown. And I have made so many new LGBTQ friends. Sometimes I'm kind of like their mom, sometimes I'm kind of like their peer, but I haven't had a social life and community like this since college. It just really has added a wonderful dimension to my life right now. And that leads to my announcement, what we talked about earlier. So my friend Amber and I were producing a variety show called Dear Mom, celebrating mothers of LGBTQ children. And the idea is to say thank you to moms who support their queer children. And we want to say thank you by entertaining them with music, comedy, and a little poetry. And we want them to feel like they're not alone, they're part of a community. We want to be able to laugh at what we have in common, no more doom and gloom. And in fact, in Carolyn Pearson's book, during the hardest part of their story, her family made a point of collecting jokes and making each other laugh, and they called it laughter therapy. And also, this is a chance to hear more stories. The performers will share stories. And again, it's on Saturday, May 10th. That's the Saturday before Mother's Day. It's at 2 p.m. in Provo. We'll put a link to more information in the show notes, but also you can find more information at www.we'rehereutah.com. You do have to include the W's, and it's We're Here, WEREHERE, Utah, UTAH.com. But again, it's a Saturday before Mother's Day, so it could be a Mother's Day gift. We're hoping dads and kids will buy gifts for wives and moms, or moms will buy tickets for themselves and their friends. And we got a Project Rainbow grant to help with this. So shout out to Project Rainbow. And I know not all of your listeners are local here, but if this goes over well, maybe we can do more of these and maybe we can take it on the road. So again, it's Saturday, May 2nd at 2 p.m. at the Find Lab in downtown Provo. That's a photography store and art gallery. And you can find more information at www.we'rehereutah.com. So that's my story, Richard.
Thank you, Helen. So prepared. You got through a lot of content in like 40 minutes. Thank you for your level of preparation and all the things you shared. And I learned new things listening to you. Here's some of the things I wrote down. Listeners, I kind of do this. I love the Carolyn Pearson quote about sort of paraphrasing dogma versus personal stories and the importance of personal stories to help us better understand. I don't know if your daughter will listen to this, but what a remarkable woman. Just right from the beginning with kindness in kindergarten. Black belt's a huge accomplishment. We've done some of that in our family, and that is incredible discipline. Then to get 3 academic awards at high school, and I love the grace of the teachers using her pronouns, and so that was just a beautiful part of the story. And I love this nature versus nurture discussion. And I thought about that a little bit. I probably thought this is more nature versus nurture. Thought that's a fair discussion, but it sort of assumes that we have cis children or straight children. And if the nurture had just been right, we'd still have a cis children or a straight child, cis meaning non-transgender. And I don't agree with that anymore. I mean, I think, the only thing you did on a nurture standpoint was just to create a safe place to come out. And I think that's a great thing to do, is to let your kids come out and be able to walk this road together. So I just think people come this way, listeners. There's probably some exceptions to that, perhaps, but I think we should always go on the assumption that these people come as they are, and our job is to support them and love them and create a safe place for them to come out. I love your grace with the pronouns, how you talked about, biological sex and now why you're using she, her. And you're very comfortable doing that through the entire podcast. And I think just role models the grace of that space. I think it's fine you joked about transitioning. I think that just didn't cause your cis child to be trans. I think it just is part of a good family culture. I think it's okay to cry. I wrote that down as you were talking about that. Parents, you can support your kiddo, but you can also grieve, the change, your original expectations, especially for a trans kid. And I think it's okay to take care of yourself. And part of that is sort of the grief that comes with that and the acceptance and the peace that can come. So I think it's okay to take care of yourself and to cry. I think that's just a human thing. It doesn't mean you don't love your trans kid and can't support them. I think I loved, this coming out story to you, and I think you did a good job, and even showing the Encircle video, create a safe culture. But I love that you recognized and gave grace for everybody else that you weren't the first person they came out to. And often you frame that up really well, Helen, that, that's really risky. So lots of times people come out as someone that's less risky. It's not a family member. And not to take that personally for us that are family members. I thought it was good you recognized that church isn't a safe place for trans people. There may be some exceptions to that, but these stories I've heard, it's a pretty difficult space for trans people trying to fully participate in the church, even if they love the church and want to, especially with the new handbook that came out in August 2024. So that's just kind of, I agree with that. It's a pragmatic reality of where we are. But I also love this long list of people at church that you knew that would love her. So it's complicated. But I just thought that was honest. I love the University of Utah housing experience. And every kid that I know, including our kids, when they go to a new college, they're worried about that. And then if you're trans, you're double worried or triple worried. And I just loved what those students did for your daughter and their name badges with their pronouns on them, and how that just sends a message of acceptance and love. And then the way she was able to room with 3 other women, and they were aware of that. It wasn't a surprise to them, and they could handle that. And there's probably I think you had a good word to describe this, was sort of a, figured out. And so there was no surprises. Everybody was understanding what was going on. But the support she felt from those fellow roommates and the support she felt from the University of Utah, and I just thought that was beautiful. And to me, no one compromised anything to do that. No one sold out their values. No one compromised. We just practiced discipleship of inclusion, and what can we do to help someone feel included and welcome. I thought it was just a beautiful story. I too am sad about the new law. I'm glad you talked that what happened with your daughter could not happen anymore. And that's just the reality of new legislation in Utah. And I mourn with it for that. And I hope we can go back to kind of a case-by-case basis with thoughtful, intentional people. I think people need to be aware they're rooming with a trans person, which in your daughter's situation they were, and sort of have the skills to navigate that. Sounds like they did, and it was a good experience. Trans people aren't inherently dangerous. This isn't a sad tragedy, to use those words, having a trans person, because you look at the fruits of who your daughter is and her transitioning. I love these words. She's happier. She has light. She's obviously accomplishing a lot. And so I think we assume having a trans person or being trans is a bad outcome. In my experience, it's not. It doesn't create harm in themselves. It doesn't create harm in our community. And often, and by far most of the times, they feel more peace as they're living in congruence with who they are, their gender identity and their presentation. Yeah, it can get them sideways with church teachings. I recognize that. But often, like I just said, they're happier and they're more at peace and they're able to move forward in their lives. And we have trans people functioning in all areas of society. Doctors, lawyers, nurses, teachers, political leaders, government leaders, that's kind of the same thing. They're competent, capable, blessing the lives of others, serving in the military, that's kind of under review. My military friends talk to me about how we just recognize, can someone do the job? We don't care if they're gay, straight, trans, cis. Our culture, this isn't speaking for everybody in the military, but those that I've talked to says, we just care if they can do the job. That's the motto we're beating to. So you just go do a great job of humanizing people. Then I love this show, listeners, and just taking your gifts and saying, what can I do? And then you found Amber and you're doing this show on May 10th. And I just think that's great. And we'll put the show link in our show notes. We're here, Utah. 3 4-letter words, I think. I'm going to mess that up if I keep talking about the URL, but it's there in the show notes. And I wonder, it's just great the way you're serving and helping and finding community for yourself and using that to bless the lives of others. So sometimes I talk about the Gene Kratz Apollo 13 quote on this show, listeners. And Apollo 13 is, as you probably know from the movie, everything goes sideways. And that may what feels happening to you with kids not fully participating in the church and now having a trans daughter. And that could be like this sad, tragic Apollo 13. And that's the way the commanders were sort of feeling, or the astronaut officials at NASA were feeling. And then the commander, during that worst time of Apollo 13, stood up in this famous moment from the movie for me. He said, "Excuse me, this is going to be our finest hour." And it was. And what they did for Apollo 13 to bring that mission and those astronauts safely back to Earth was one of NASA's finest moments. And it strengthened the Apollo program going forward. So I think supporting your trans daughter is one of your family's finest moments. And her courage to come out and be authentic and move forward in her life and recognize this as part of her journey, to me, is part of that beautiful story. So I'm going to turn it back to you, Helen, for any more thoughts or anything I said that is kind of a little off to what you want to, how you see things.
No, thank you. I've never felt so validated. I'm a validation addict. So thank you. That was a great fix for me. I appreciate everything you said. I'm glad my daughter's story means that much to you, just like it means to me. And you've summed it up really well. So thank you.
Very kind. Thank you, listeners, for listening. A lot of these podcasts are possible because if you reach out to me and feel it's time to share your story, often it's like Helen. It's the first time doing this, and you just feel it's the right time to share my story because it can help others. I think Helen's been listening to the podcast, and some of your stories may have helped her. And this is the purpose of the podcast, is so really brave people walking unique roads can find other people that have been on this road a little bit longer. Often that's a parent, and sometimes it's a queer person that's kind of newly trying to figure this out, that's listening to other queer people. So all of you that come on the podcast are my heroes, but some of you feel like it's not going to be your journey to be on the podcast. And don't feel shame for that. Don't feel you're not authentic, you're not courageous. We're trying to take away shame from anybody's story through sharing of stories. But if it's not your thing, that's fine. Just continue to do your best to love yourself and love those around you. So we'll put some more show notes. I'll probably put some of Helen's contact information. Do you want to mention, do you want us to put your Instagram or Facebook or anything in the show notes if someone wants to find you?
I'd love to share my Instagram. You can find me at Helen Anderson Comedy. I will say sometimes it's a little irreverent. I am a trained comedian, but I do sometimes poke fun at BYU and the church. But actually, some of those jokes, some of my best jokes were ones I wrote while I was at BYU, and they were totally approved then. So I think I'm in the right range, but just a fair warning that I do get a little irreverent at sometimes.
It's fine. That's you, Helen. We want you to be you. So thank you for using our gifts. I believe in humor and companionship and community. So I love that you have community. And it's so important for mental health in our world right now, especially with the isolation that goes on. So I love what you're doing in your own journey and bringing hope and healing community to others. So we'll put your Instagram in the show notes in case people want to find you. So this is Helen Anderson and Richard Ostler signing off from another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love.